Hello everybody, I am Keaton and this is Kid Catholic Season 10, Episode 9. I hope that you all are having an absolutely wonderful day so far. Before we get into today's video, if you wanted to click the subscribe button down below, I would greatly appreciate that. And so it is now, we are a little bit into the Easter season, the most joyful time of the year for us as Catholics. And what I want to talk about this week, I'm talking about it because I feel like it's so prevalent and so important in our world today, and that is temptation, because it's a pretty simple topic on the surface, right? We know that temptation is bad, we know that it's hard to resist temptation, but sometimes we don't stop to think about why it's hard to resist that temptation, right? I know we've all, with certain sins, maybe some sins stronger than others, maybe different for a lot of people, maybe the same for a lot of people, but we all get tempted, bottom line, right? Because we all sin. And so I wanted to look at today practical ways as to how we avoid that temptation. And how to avoid temptation is a loaded question, not because it's hard to come up with an answer, not because it's hard to answer, but because there are so many ways to avoid that temptation. Right? And the biggest one that I want to start off with is faith. And I want to look at scripture for this. I have an absolutely fantastic verse for how faith enables us to resist temptation. And right here in James 1, 2 through 7, we read, "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you meet various trials, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all men generously and without reproaching, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways, will receive anything from the Lord." The part that I specifically want to point out, the biggest here, is right there. "For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." We're not just told that when our faith is tested, especially through temptation, right? Because temptation is a testing of our faith. Our faith does get tested when we are tempted, right? That tempting of our faith, it's not just hard, it's not just bad, but that tempting, that testing produces steadfastness, produces commitment, right? And produces that commitment to God, because faith is more than just belief in God. Faith is belief in God and trust in God. And that trust is a big thing. And if we have that faith, if we have that trust, then that temptation, whether it's in a moment where we're about to sin, where we just feel the urge to sin, the need to sin, that faith reminds us that there is never a time when there is a need to sin. And that faith can push us away, sort of off the edge, and bring us back to God because we have that trust with Jesus. And another way of avoiding temptation that I want to talk about that ties right into this idea of faith is a personal relationship with God, right? Because I want to repeat this as many times as possible because it is so important. A personal relationship with Jesus just makes everything easier as a Catholic, right? Because too often we see God and we see Jesus as just someone who we could never think of talking to and someone who doesn't have time for us, even though we may subconsciously think that, when that couldn't be further from the truth, right? Not only should Jesus be our best friend, but he wants to be our best friend, right? And just like a normal human friendship, you talk to somebody to gain that friendship. We need to talk to Jesus. We need him to talk back. We need to be willing to listen. And if we build that friendship, then think about how much easier resisting that temptation will become. Because the bottom line is sin hurts Jesus, right? Venial sin separates us from Jesus, but mortal sin entirely separates us from Jesus, right? And both are awful. And sin is obviously not a good thing. And so it does hurt Jesus. It does make Jesus upset when we sin because we are specifically going against his will when all he wants is to be our friend. And that temptation leads us into that. But if we have faith in Jesus, which is trust and belief, and we have a relationship with him, and we are his best friend, and we are close to him, then that temptation will become easier to resist because we know that, hey, if I sin, I am hurting my friend. Right? If I sin, if I do this, I am hurting my best friend. I am separating myself from my best friend. And that's never a good thing. So even though it may be subconscious, that relationship with Jesus helps us to push back that temptation, which I think with today's world, with the internet, with the access to so many things, temptation is like maybe stronger than it ever has been, right? And we all get tempted in that way, and it's about building a relationship with him. And then the last way that I want to look at sort of how we resist temptation is a very practical way. a very logistic way of resisting temptation, right? We all get tempted with sins. Like I mentioned, some sins more than others, some of us more than others. Maybe some of us, it's one specific sin super strong, right? Let's just use this analogy. Let's say that it's gluttony that we struggle with as a sin, right? That gluttony is a sin that we struggle with. So let's put ourselves in that situation where we feel tempted to consume all this food, right? Or we feel tempted to, I don't know, fight with our younger brother, right? Because I would totally never do that. Let's say that we feel these temptations, right? If we tell ourselves in that moment, what I like to do is I like to say it out loud more than just think it, right? If we say out loud, even just a couple words, Jesus, I trust in you. Jesus, I love you, right? Something like that. It can pull us back from that urge to sin because it reminds us of Jesus. And so even just forcing ourselves to say his name out loud, we know that Jesus is the victor over sin. Sin has no power over Jesus. So we shouldn't let sin have power over us if we find Jesus, right? All we need to do is come to him, and he's willing and he's wanting us so bad to come to him, and that is how that temptation will become easier to resist. Don't get me wrong, doing all of these things, it's not going to make temptation non-existent. It's not going to make it to where we never sin again. It's not going to make it to where we never get tempted again. But it will help us so much to fight back against this urge of temptation, against this urge to sin that almost seems like second nature, because the bottom line is that temptation, as scary as it may be and as scary as it may sound, that comes from Satan, because at the end of the day, his ultimate goal is to lead us as far away from God as he can, is to separate us as far away from God as we can, and we know that sin is what separates us. And so if we have committed a mortal sin, and we are totally separated from Christ, even a venial sin, right, which is still a very, very bad thing, we as Catholics are lucky enough to have the sacrament of confession, right? We have the ability to get these sins forgiven. And so we need to use that to the best of our abilities. We need to go to confession. We need to confess these sins. We need to start actually building a prayer life, actually building a spiritual life, a relationship with Jesus if we don't have one already, reminding ourselves these things out loud. And then all of a sudden, that temptation that we're feeling will become so much easier to resist, and we will be kept out of sin, which ultimately, I mean, it all comes back to this in Catholicism, right? Will help to lead us to heaven. So now that the topic is done, do y'all know what it's time for now? It's time for
the Saint of the Week.
And today's Saint of the Week is Saint Teresa of Calcutta. And the reason I chose her for today's saint is because if we're talking about resisting temptation, if we're talking about bringing out kindness and avoiding sin, she's like the perfect person to look at, right? Otherwise known as Mother Teresa, right? Mother Teresa is a very famous person in the secular world, but what a lot of people don't know is when she was canonized, we now refer to her as Saint Teresa of Calcutta, not Saint Mother Teresa. That confused me at first too. But she is a 20th century saint born in 1910, and from a very young age she was very devout in her Christian faith. She became a nun and spent a lot of time in Calcutta, India, and was so dedicated to caring for the poor, to living out a life of charity. So I can't pronounce words today, that she even founded the Missionaries of Charity in Calcutta, India, which is why we refer to her as Saint Teresa of Calcutta. She exemplified so much kindness, not just in the Catholic world, but in the world as a whole, that she was actually awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979, which is kind of crazy that we have like this award that we see so many modern people get, and then we find out that a saint got it in the 70s, right? Which is really, really cool. She was canonized in 2016, in which she became referred to as Saint Teresa of Calcutta. But she is looked upon as one of the most charitable saints, one of the most charitable people in general, not even saints, that we've seen in the 20th century. She spent so much time in charity, dedicating her work to the poor, making sure that the poor always had something to eat, and making sure that her fellow sisters knew how to care for the poor also, because it's more than just giving them food, and it's more than just giving them material items, but it's being for them also. And St. Teresa of Calcutta knew that, and she was able to exemplify that through her work. And when we live in a time where secular temptation and the temptation of our modern world to sin and to commit these sins is so strong, and sometimes we feel like we just can't resist that temptation, right? I know that we've all been there. We can look through the saints because all of the saints were able to resist temptation, right? They sinned just like you and I. Saint Teresa of Calcutta sinned, yet she was able to resist that temptation and still bring herself close to Jesus Christ. And that is something that we can look through as well. So anytime we feel like we're struggling with resisting temptation, we feel like we're struggling with sin, maybe it's one specific sin that we can't get out of, maybe it's a multitude of them, whatever it may be, we're not going to be able to get by it unless we start looking at the lives of the saints. Because too often there's this misconception that the saints were just born with magical powers and that they were just perfect, holy, perfect people, right? And that's not true. They were human just like you and I. They made mistakes just like you and I. They sinned just like you and I. They fell into temptation just like you and I. And yet they were able to achieve the ultimate goal of getting to heaven and dedicate their lives to Christ, as did Saint Teresa of Calcutta. So Saint Teresa of Calcutta, pray for us. So thank you all so much for watching this week's episode of Kid Catholic. Before you click off this video, if you would go to my website, kidcatholic.com, all my videos are up there. You can buy a Kid Catholic t-shirt up there. You can email me about speaking engagements up there because I'm doing in-person talks again since the COVID shutdowns. I'll be happy to do them over Zoom too, but I'm also doing them in person. So if you want me to come and speak to your men's group, women's group, youth group, RCIA, school, church, right, whatever it may be, please email me at kidcatholic1@gmail.com and message me via my website, like I said. Please check out all three of my social medias, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. The link to all three of those will be in the description down below. And please comment any saint or topic suggestions that you might have for future videos. Like I said, thank you all so much for watching. I hope that you guys are having an absolutely beneficial, joyful Easter season so far and a wonderful day. I'll see y'all next week, and hi, Brielle.